Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The former WBC champion Deontay Wilder says that Andy Ruiz Jr. is at the top of his hit list if a Tyson Fury third fight is not going to happen. He says Andy Ruiz Jr. is the type of fighter, the type of top fight that he would like to have. So he made these comments to a YouTube channel, Blue Blood Sports TV, so you can check that interview out at your leisure. But in terms of what's falling out of that interview with these sorts of comments, that's a really good fight, and it makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. And it's one of these fights, actually, I've said on the channel a few times before, that if the third fight had have happened and Deontay Wilder lost to Tyson Fury again, that fight with Andy Ruiz Jr. would be the biggest in-house fight that they could make at PBC, and for a lot of reasons it would make sense. And in this instance, he's coming off a loss to Fury. Andy Ruiz Jr. is coming off a loss to Anthony Joshua. It is one of these type redemption fights, but also you can pitch it and market it as, these two coming back. One of them is going to make a push for a title again. There's a lot on the line. All that sort of stuff. There's a lot of narratives there with this sort of fight. I think a lot of interest. Stylistically, it's interesting too, and I'll come to that. But I think in terms of an in-house fight at PBC, it's the biggest that they can make. And with Andy Ruiz Jr. coming off, obviously a pretty good 2019 where he beat Joshua, but then he lost to Joshua, but still his profile grew exponentially. Behind Deontay Wilder, he is in my view, the biggest name in the PBC heavyweight stable. So then you have Wilder also coming off a loss. I think you can make this, and it's at the point in both of their careers, especially Deontay Wilder, where you're at the cashing in period. And this is what they've been doing for a couple of years now, making those big fights, making the big money. And this would be, in my view, the biggest money fight for Deontay Wilder outside of Tyson. And this for Deontay Wilder, I think, is the biggest money and easiest. And this fight for Deontay Wilder is the easiest to make, I believe, out of anything that's available right now that's going to provide any decent chunk of change. Certainly, it would be a pay-per-view worthy event. And there would be a lot of interest. Would Deontay Wilder be able to bounce back? Clearly, some of the things that he's been saying more recently would indicate that he's struggling with that loss to Tyson Fury, all the excuses in the world, but this video is not about that. It's about this potential fight if it were to happen, because it would be a great fight. I'd really look forward to seeing that. Deontay Wilder being the significantly bigger man, being a big puncher, and Andy Ruiz Jr. is, as we saw, he can be dropped, he can be hurt. Obviously, he was hurt against Joshua, but not to the point where he was completely out of it. He was able to rebound and then knock Joshua out in the ensuing exchanges back in June 2019. And I think a lot of people would favour Andy Ruiz Jr. too if he was able to pressure and push Deontay Wilder back, because Wilder doesn't necessarily have a great back foot game. Could make it very interesting. Get up on his chest, bang away to the body and head, put him under real pressure. But there is something to be said that Andy Ruiz Jr. generally works off what you give him. He's a bit of a front foot counter puncher. So Deontay Wilder, probably having seen what Anthony Joshua did in the rematch, keeping it long, using a jab, I could totally see him trying to employ something not exactly the same, in the sense of trying to keep it at the end of a jab and then make him walk onto a right hand. And as we know, Deontay Wilder, if he can get you onto a right hand, he can certainly hurt you, damage you, and potentially take you out. So it wouldn't necessarily be one of these things where I think people should just say that Andy Ruiz Jr. would just win. Remembering, Tyson Fury was the bigger guy against Deontay Wilder. He employed a very aggressive strategy in the rematch, and it paid off. But part of the success there was his attributes too, being 6'9" and having the longer reach over Wilder, which hasn't really happened too much in Wilder's career. But Andy Ruiz Jr. being a significantly shorter man, a significantly shorter reach, Deontay Wilder would have something like about 9 or 10 inches in reach. That's a significant advantage. And if he can stay healthy, has his athleticism, somewhere near or nearabouts what has been in his prime, I think it could be a very interesting fight. It's not necessarily a fight where you can just sort of say one guy over the other is going to take it. I think it's pretty much close to a 50-50. Maybe I would lean in Ruiz's favor, but I think it's by no means some sort of lock for one or the other. And I could see Deontay Wilder landing something and hurting Andy Ruiz Jr. So it is a case that this is a very interesting fight. I'd want to see it, and it looks like that third fight with Tyson Fury is gone for good, and the fact that Deontay Wilder is talking about potential next fights, you can make an argument, is there really legal action going to be coming, or is that, all hot air? It's hard to say, but obviously he is starting to think about a what next if it's not Tyson Fury, and I think that's a good sign, and it's good to hear that he's not necessarily going to take some sort of lower tier fight, but with, injuries and age and all that sort of stuff starting to compound and build up, hopefully for a lot of these guys, especially at the top end of the division, they are having meaningful fights, and if Wilder steps into a meaningful fight like this, that would be fantastic. I think that's something we would all like to see. It's a great fight, and if it does happen, and I hope it happens, it'd be fantastic. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.